The Middle Ages. 1. Definition. The Middle Ages, also called the medieval period, was from the 5th to the 15th century. 2. Feudalism. From the second half of the Middle Ages, Europe was run by a system of government known as feudalism. Under feudalism, the land in a country was owned by the king, who passed on most of it to his so-called vassals, who were the barons and bishops in the country. They then passed on most of the land to knights. In return for land and protection, the person agreed to fight for and add to the army of the person who gave them the land. 3. Medieval castles. When a lord first moved into an area, they built temporary motte and bailey castles. Once set up, the lord would build either a manor house or a stone castle if he was very powerful and wealthy. Stone castles were surrounded by the outer curtain wall, and that was very thick at the base as a defence against battering rams. The bailey was inside the wall where the church, workshops and guard rooms were situated. Moats, drawbridges and portcullises added to the security of the castle. The lord and lady lived in a 3 or 4 storey stone building called a keep. In later times, tower houses were used when large castles were no longer defensible against gunpowder and when times were more peaceful. 4. Becoming a knight. Knights lived by a code of chivalry by which they agreed to be loyal to their lord, to fight for him when needed, to respect women, to protect the weak, and to keep the Christian faith. Young sons of lords would be sent off to the homes of other lords at the age of 7, when they would become pages, serving on table and carrying out jobs for the lord and lady. When they reached 14 years, they became squires who assisted the knights with their horses and weapons and went to the tournaments. Once 21, they were made into knights at a ceremony called dubbing. 5. Law and order. Those accused of crime would be brought by the bailiff to the manor house, where the lord would judge them and sentence them to some punishment. The most common form of punishment was to be put in the stocks. A ducking stool was used to lower nagging or gossiping women into the river. Robbers could have their hands cut off, and murderers were executed. Prisons were used only for soldiers captured in war and for hostages, but not as a punishment for crime. 6. Religion. Bishops were the church leaders in a diocese and appointed the priests to work in the parishes of the towns and villages. Christian churches were usually among the few stone buildings in the castle bailey, or in the town centre, or in the village. People paid 1/10 of their crops or wealth to the church. This was called a tithe, and was in return for the services provided by the church, such as baptisms, marriages and funerals. 7. Monasteries. In the Middle Ages, holy men called monks went to live in monasteries that were built in remote areas, away from the people, where they could work and pray in peace and quiet. The chief monk was an abbot. Monks had different jobs such as farming, working in the refectory where the meals were eaten, working in the infirmary where the sick were looked after, or in the hostelry or guest house where travellers were accommodated. Some monks worked in the scriptorium, writing manuscripts by hand with quills and ink on vellum or parchment. Many orders of monks had special vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. 8. Peasants, serfs and freemen. Peasants, called serfs, rented land from the local lord on which they grew crops and grazed cattle. The lord's permission was needed to move to another village or to marry. A small number of peasants were freemen who also rented land from the lord but were free to move and marry without permission. The houses of the peasants were not much better than the wattle and daub houses of the earlier historical periods. They usually slept in one room and ate their meals in another room. In winter, the peasants brought their animals into the house for warmth and to keep them safe. Their clothes were either linen, made from flax grown locally, or woolen from sheep's wool. Their food was mainly dark bread, pottage, that's a porridge and vegetable soup, and cheese. Meat was rarely eaten. Peasants drank water from the local river, ale and cider. Pastimes included many games that survive today, such as noughts and crosses, draughts, chess, wrestling, and hoodman blind. 9. The three-field system or open field system of farming. Farming was carried out in 3 large open fields. The use of the fields was rotated so that one field grew wheat for bread, another grew barley or oats for beer or food or feed, and the third field would be left fallow. It grew nothing, for a year to allow the soil to recover. Cattle grazed on the village common. Medieval villages were surrounded by forests where the wild boar and deer that were hunted by the lords grazed. 10. Medieval towns. Medieval towns usually developed around large castles or river crossings and usually had fewer than 1,000 inhabitants. The towns had to get a charter from the king to allow the local town councils to run them. Towns were usually walled for protection with gates that could be entered only during the day. The main street or high street was usually paved and was slightly above the level of the other streets. The merchants and tradesmen had well-built timber houses on the high street. Poorer people had their wattle and daub houses farther from the centre. As many houses were timber built, a curfew bell was rung at night to remind the townspeople to put out the fires. Houses had back gardens where vegetables were grown and where pigs and hens were kept for pork and eggs. Other food could be bought at the weekly market that was held in the market square in the town centre. 11. The guilds. Merchants and master craftsmen formed guilds that controlled medieval towns. These guilds set prices for their services and decided how a person would become a tradesman. Medieval trades included shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, butchers, weavers who made cloth, tailors who made clothes, coopers who made barrels, millers who made flour, masons who built with stone, tanners who made leather, and chandlers who made candles, among others. To become a craftsman, a boy became an apprentice at the age of 12 and worked for 7 years without pay, learning the trade and living in the workshop at the back of the shop. They then became a journeyman and either continued to work for the master for pay or would travel to other towns looking for a new master who would pay more or provide better conditions. To become a master craftsman, the journeyman had to pay a large sum of money to the guild and produce a masterpiece of high enough quality. Few could manage to find enough money to make this payment, so they stayed journeymen. Lastly, 12. The bubonic plague or the Black Death. Towns were dirty because the town people threw their waste, including toilet waste, into the gutters in the streets. They didn't wash regularly and everyone carried fleas. Diseases were common and spread easily among the tightly packed towns. Sometimes diseases had devastating effects, like the bubonic plague or the Black Death, that killed between 30 and 50% of the population of Western Europe.